So we're learning how to understand controls at our clients. So at your client, they're going to have various information systems. And you need to understand, of course, any system that impacts the financial statements. And you need to understand what kind of general controls they have in place, because this is going to impact typically the control environment, and so how well other controls get executed. So we've got program development controls, program change controls, computer operations controls, and access to programs and data controls. So this is across the board for all parts of the system. How do we develop our controls? When we have a change, right? We need to update something. How do we do that? The actual day-to-day running of the computers. How do we make sure those are safely operated and do what we want? And access to program and controls, right? So who can use this system? How do we keep hackers out, right? So these are the general controls that your clients will use. And so we need to talk a little bit about each of these a little more specifically. So obviously, before you can worry about controls, you have to have a system, right? So somebody has to be responsible for purchasing the software, writing the code for the software, right? So you have to get your system in place somehow, right? So there has to be some system for who orders it, who installs it, how they make those arrangements, right? How we decide what to purchase, that they work, we test them, we validate them. You don't just buy a new system and then turn it on, right? You imagine you're a bank and you buy a new system. Well, you're not just going to overnight flip the switch and start using this new system. You're going to test it, you're going to validate it, because you need it to work. When you flip that switch, it's got to work. You have to have appropriate documentation. So especially if you have your own developers who are writing code for you, or not you, but your client, if your client has their own developers who are writing code, and all the big organizations do, Walmart uses SAP, but Walmart has developers working to customize and specialize their SAP. All right, so do they create documentation as they go so somebody else can come in and understand what they did? So your client needs to have program development controls in place, and you need to understand how they work. The system development life cycle helps us understand how these information systems get installed, right? So we identify requirements. We're going to switch to a more online mode than we've had in the past. So we're going to need a new system. So it's going to have to do this and that, right? And we analyze the feasibility, we determine the system specs. In other words, how many sales will we need to be able to do? How many users will need to be able to access this? How will it work? Will it work, right? So we figure out our specs, we develop the programs, we design procedures. So the program gets developed, right? The computer program, the software, and we have to design procedures for the users, right? So some users are going to use this, and what do they need to do? What do they enter where? Then we come to the conversion and implementation. In other words, we're going to switch to this new software. So we have to employ the training. We have to employee train the people who are going to be using it, implement it in our daily operations, and now we're using it. Then we have to maintain it and audit it, see how it's going. We do system analysis and using the information from maintenance and audits, and we go, okay, now we need to change it, and we start back here, right? So that's how systems are developed and how they're implemented. So once you get your system in place, you will have to change things. So you don't want just anybody to be able to go, oh, hey, well, I think this needs to be changed. Go in, type new code, change it, and it's changed. No, you can't have that, right? So there have to be controls in place that say this is how we modify our programs, right? There has to be an authorization, right? Somebody requests it, and somebody approves that request, And then the users participate. They say, hey, when we do this, this doesn't work, so we need you to change it, right? So users who use the system participate. How do we validate that? Very typically, if you ever get involved in something like this, you'll see that users are brought in they have a test system, so you get a software up and going on a test system, and somebody will come in and just do transactions and do all kinds of crazy stuff and see how they do. And of course, everything with the change has to be documented, just like you have to document your original software so people will know what's what and they can go in and fix things. Well, when you fix something, you have to document that, what you did. Here's what this code does. If there are emergency changes or migrating programs, you need to have controls for that, because you don't want somebody to make an emergency change as a way to get around an authorized change. I mean, yes, sometimes there are emergencies. Oh my God, we've entered the wrong price in and it's charging $1 for milk. It needs to be $3.89, and so somebody needs to go in and change the price, how that's coded, but there needs to be a something for that. Operations. So you've bought the software, or you've written the code for the software, and you've tweaked it as you need it. It needs to be run, right? You need to make sure that hackers can't hack in. You need to make sure that it's processing things the way they're supposed to be processed. You need to choose how you're going to run it. Are you going to run it as a batch all at once, like at the end of the night? Are you going to run it real time? Right? So your clients are making these decisions, and you need to understand how your client does it. Why? Because if something's happening in a batch, it should be something that doesn't happen very frequently, right? Because if somebody is relying on something like if you're doing a sale, the price shouldn't change a lot. Gasoline prices might change every day or every couple of days, right? They're volatile. So, but price changes should probably run in a batch. They don't change that often. But real-time processing, if you're a bank and somebody's making a withdrawal, you want that real-time process. You don't want them to be able to come and make a withdrawal of $100, then come back an hour later and withdraw another, and it all goes through in a batch, and then you find out they didn't have that $100, right? So and it's going to make a difference to you as an auditor, because if something's real time, then you can rely on it more than something that's a batch. You have to have controls in place for operations. You don't want hackers coming in. You don't want employees who have the ability to write code going in and writing some code you don't want, right? So you have to have duties separated. A system analyst who says, I've analyzed the system, we need to change this in this way, isn't the person who can program it, and isn't the person who runs the computers and installs that software. You need these people to be different, because if you can figure out how to change something, write the code, and install it, like the operators, you can do whatever you want. Steal information, sell it, steal credit card numbers, do all kinds of bad stuff. So you have to have separation of duties in the computer operations area. Operations need to make sense, right? As data is stored and updated, people need to be able to access it and follow the latest changes. That what this grandfather, father, son means. It's like, I need to be able to follow the process for how something changed. We need to be able to back stuff up. What if things crash? Where do I get my backup, my disaster recovery? So these are all the operations. As we're running it day to day, what controls are in place that allow for backup recovery, that make sure we can follow the transaction when something's changed. And of course, access. So an important part of internal control is segregation of duty. And so in a computer system, that means people can only access what they're supposed to. So your password will only let you do a sales invoice. If that's your job, you can only do that. You can't go to the personnel, human resources module and raise your pay, right? You can't go to the purchasing module and cut a check, right? You can only do what you do. Right? So, and also you don't want somebody from outside coming in and stealing, hacking, doing something bad. So there's things like passwords, automatic log off after a certain period of time, reviewing access rights. Access rights means when a password is used, whoever's using that password can go to this part of the system and not that part. They can't access it. They don't have the right to access it. So you have to make sure people change jobs, procedures change, and people no longer need access to that part of the system. You want to make sure people aren't accessing stuff they don't need. All right? Whether they're bad people or not, they just don't need access to it. And of course, you need a way to catch security breaches, and you need ways to report it. Controls in information systems are going to accuracy and occurrence, right? The data makes sure that the transactions are always the same every time and they're the right numbers. It's not like the computer's going to make a math error, right? It's going to total exactly what it's supposed to total. It's going to use the right price. It's going to use the right discount if it's been inputted properly. And we'll get to those things when we get to application level controls. But as long as all the input stuff is good and the processing stuff is good and the outputting stuff is good, the application controls is good, you're fine, you're accurate, right? And of course occurrence, if you restrict access and only authorized people can do that transaction, it occurred, right? So that's why information systems are so great. They bring that consistency every time, but we have to be able to rely on the controls, right? So that's why we understand them like we're doing now, and then we test them. So here's some examples of general controls. The point being, there are going to be controls like using appropriate documentation, making sure that there's segregation of duties, making sure people use passwords. All these controls that apply to every part of the system are going to the objectives of making sure that programs are developed that we want and that work, making sure that only changes that we want and work are made, that our computer operations are safe and everything is stored and backed up. And of course, only people who we want to access the system, and only the part that's appropriate for them. So next video, we're going to talk about application level controls. So when you do a sale, when you perform a transaction, controls for actual transaction level application use.